Hey there, welcome to the CMMC Compliance Guide podcast. I'm Stacey.
And I'm Brooke.
From Justice IT Consulting, where we help businesses like yours navigate CMMC and NIST 800-171 compliance. We're hired guns, getting companies fast-tracked to compliance, but today we're here to give you all the secrets for free, so if you want to tackle it yourself, you're equipped to do so. Let's dive into today's episode and keep your business on track. Today we're talking about scoping. Specifically, what it actually costs when a contractor gets it wrong. People throw around the phrase 6 figures a lot, so let's get into these numbers and see if they're real or just marketing. So let's get started. Is 6 figures a fair number or is it a bit exaggerated, Brooke?
Well, the problem from overscoping or underscoping can be all over the place depending on how big the contractor is, depending on how complex their setup is. All sorts of fun stuff. So, yes, it definitely could be a 6-figure mistake for overscoping. Could be some other problems if you underscope, and I guess those might lead into 6-figure issues later on. But yeah, there definitely could be a 6-figure problem. So a lot of people like to throw around the 6-figure number. You could be overscoping and cost yourself, $100,000, $300,000. The question is, what size contractor is that? How complex is their system? What time period is that cost? All sorts of fun things. And so you could see overscoping cost you, $30,000 or $40,000, over a year or 3 years, or you could see it cost you $300,000, depending on how big of a, or even more, I guess, but depending on what size contractor you are. For most small businesses, what we think of as small businesses, it won't be that high. But it still will cost money. And for small businesses, yes, that still less than 6 figures means a lot. So, yes, it definitely could be 6 figures, could be less, but there's a whole lot of factors there that go into it.
So before we get into specific figures, where is this data actually coming from?
Well, part of it recently comes from the DoW CIO, Kirsten Davies, and the SBA, Small Business Administration. They threw out some numbers that were wildly off. But, for what the government considers a, quote, small business, then those numbers could have been accurate for a 500-person company or something like that, right? And that's if you way overscope and have a big problem or make your setup really complicated. And I guess really I think they were conflating compliance with certification in that case, and they were talking about certification costing $500,000, and so I don't know of any certifications that have been for small business that have been even over $100,000. So, most of the certifications I know of, just for the certification assessment, you're talking in a $30,000 to $40,000 range. Even for a complicated one. The simpler it is, simpler the environment is, the easier it is to assess, and the cost will be cheaper, right? Not necessarily the size, but the complexity. That's what drives a lot of it. Size does to some degree, but the complexity does as well. So if you've got 4 different cloud systems involved, and an on-prem server and a whole bunch of remote users, and this, that, and the other, and you have Macs and you have Windows computers, and that assessment that assessment cost is probably going to go up, right? However, if it's all on premise, you don't use any cloud tools, or very few, at least not in scope for CUI, then that brings down your cost as well. But we're talking about the assessment. So, but as far as where those numbers come from, aside from the recent CMMC pause and the DoW CIO, they come from see-through PAOs, RPOs like us, other people that are in the ecosystem that have said this is what we see, right? You generally don't have any context around that, or not much context as to what exactly that entailed. So that's where those numbers come from. Reddit, LinkedIn, whatever else you may see out there, but there's nothing there's no studies, there's no actual real data behind that other than what people see and what they talk about.
So let's hop into overscoping.
Sure.
What does pulling too much into scope actually cost?
Well, again, it depends. That's the biggest answer you'll really get. So overscoping, it can increase cost. It depends on what all you pull in. If you pull in cloud systems, if it's just a pure number of employees, then it doesn't necessarily skyrocket the cost. It will increase it somewhat, but it doesn't skyrocket it. When you start pulling in, different cloud providers and remote users and all this other stuff that you may or may not need to do, then that's when it starts really increasing the cost. Really, that's it here. But the you can increase cost if you scope in the wrong systems, if you scope in too many people, remote users, remote work locations, that may or may not need to be included. They have to be protected just like your main location. So if you have 2 offices or 3 offices or construction buildings or whatever it is, how they come into scope matters, right? And they may come into scope only for physical CUI and not electronic CUI, right? So, or logical, however you want to phrase that, but depends on what they come in scope for and how they have to be covered. So it can cause a big problem overscoping. It can cause a small problem, but generally, if you overscope, it does increase the cost to some degree. And so, the one example I can throw out, and not a clear example with numbers and everything, but if you have, for instance, a 100-user company, and you've got a mix of commercial and DoW work, do all 100 employees really have to access that CUI and process that CUI? If you have a mix of people, they may today, but you may not have to do that. If you change your workflow and say, all right, these 25 people are going to be considered in the quote enclave. We've discussed enclave. That can mean a lot of different things, but enclave is basically something separated, right, with a separate security boundary. So we can put, for a 100-person company, if we put these 25 in this enclave and consider them in scope, then that generally will lessen the burden on the rest of the network. A good rule of thumb, if you create an enclave, is to say, here's the enclave. It's where my CUI is housed, and it has to be up to level 2 standards. The rest of my network, it may process FCI, and it has to be up to level 1 standards. Level 1, you can get that done, especially if you have to have your enclave up to level 2 anyway. The rest of your network being at level 1 is a pretty simple step. It's not nothing. And if you're starting out from the get-go trying to get to level 1, again, it's not nothing. There are things you have to do. There are things you have to make sure are in place, or else you can't claim that you're level 1 compliant, right? But if you create that enclave, then absolutely it works and it can reduce the cost for you. And that's wonderful, but you have to make sure that enclave will actually work for you. For a small person, for a small company with, maybe 20 users, and maybe there's an HR person and an accounting person, but everybody else, and 100% of your work or 75% of your work is Department of War, then it's very likely that most of your network's going to have to be in scope. So you may be able to scope a few things out of it, but at that point, you're scoping a few things out and not letting them have access to CUI, which is what you should do, but you're not necessarily reducing the cost a lot.
So if we pivot to the other direction, underscoping and actually failing an assessment because of it, what does that kind of look like in terms of cost?
Well, if you fail an assessment because of that, you'll have to just do the assessment over again, right? Hopefully, if they catch it in phase 1, you can tap the brakes and stop and reschedule, right? If you pass phase 1 and get in phase 2 and you fail during that phase 2, they realize that, oh, hey, you said this was your enclave, but these computers over here are processing CUI from what you tell me. That will be that'll be a giant red flag. And you'll fail that assessment. So, hopefully you discover that, or the C3 PAO discovers that, in phase one. That would be helpful. But if you fail that, it could be a $30,000 or $40,000 redo. Or if you're bigger, more complex, it could be more, 50, 60,000, who knows? So that could be an expensive redo. The other problem is if you underscope and somehow you get through your assessment and it's not found out, and you have some sort of problem later on, some sort of whistleblower or some sort of breach or something like that, and it's found that you had CUI outside of your enclave, that is not a good thing. There may be a False Claims Act investigation that opens up. So that will be more than a $30,000 or $40,000 hit. That will be more like we're talking about six figures. It could be, 6-7 figures for that hit, depending on your contracts and the damages they assess. But those are the dangers from underscoping.
Is there one comparison that really captures this very cleanly for our listeners?
Yeah. So if you scope properly and so you make your enclave, make it a little smaller, then a lot of times, depending on your starting point, you could get that done in less than a year. If you're starting from zero, you could probably get that done in less than a year. If you overblow that scope, bring too many things in the scope, make it too complicated, that could push things out easily to 18 months or more, and could cost you a whole lot more to get everything covered and in scope, and figure out how in the world you're gonna cover remote users with Macs or something like that. Yes, if you scope properly, then that generally helps make sure that you keep that environment clean, simple, as clean as possible and simple as possible. It may not be simple, but simple as possible. So that'll help get things done a lot quicker as well.
So diving into specifics, what are the actual items companies miss when they underscope?
Well, a couple of things really. So one is not realizing that when you download CUI from a portal, a vendor portal, or a customer portal, like Lockheed or the government or something like that, when you download that, guess what? That download is CUI. So wherever it goes, that device is in scope now. It doesn't matter if you download it, transfer it into the quote enclave or not, and then delete it. It's still, that computer is still in scope. You can't do that. You can't download it to an out of scope asset and then move it over to an in scope asset. You have to do it from an in scope asset. So if you download something, if you cache something, that brings that into scope. There are some also cloud programs, and I'll just say Prevail is one. Prevail's great. We love Prevail. But if you're using Prevail Drive, they do have a VDI solution now, virtual desktop infrastructure solution. But if you're using their Prevail Drive, that stuff lives on your computer. They may take care of a lot of the controls, but that stuff lives on your computer. You open it up it gets processed and transmitted from your computer. So your computer is in scope, and a lot of people don't realize that. So that's the biggest thing, is that wherever anything that processes, stores, or transmits CUI is in scope, right? The other thing you have to think of, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead, but other things that are not in scope for CUI, but in scope still, are anything that processes, anything that secures CUI is called security protection data, or SPD, which would make that an SPA, a security protection asset. So any of those security protection assets that don't really process CUI, but process, store, or transmit CUI, but they do secure it, those are in scope for SPA, and those will be reviewed for whatever controls they cover for that CUI, right? So that's another thing you have to think about when scoping. Some other things that are in scope. Another, one thing is laptops. Well, hey, I connect to my enclave with a remote desktop, so my laptop's out of scope. But not really. If you use VDI and you configure it properly, then yes, that laptop can be out of scope, or that whatever computer it is, but typically a traveling laptop, for instance, that can be out of scope. But if it's not secured properly, or if it's a remote desktop connection instead of a true VDI, then that computer is in scope. So those are some typical things. Some other things are, like computers that connect to CNC machines on the floor and control them. Those are in scope. Those can actually be a specialized asset, but you do have to treat them properly. You do have to secure them. You do have to show how you're taking care of that, right? And another one is backup of data. So it's not just that local backup. If it gets synchronized to, which is typical these days, gets synchronized to an offsite cloud, that cloud is in scope for CUI, right? It doesn't matter that the data is encrypted. The government has come out with their FAQs that, encrypted CUI is still CUI. It's just encrypted. So those cloud systems have to meet all the compliance requirements. So, for instance, if you're backing up CUI to, a commercial cloud, then it's not gonna work. It needs to be a FedRAMP moderate authorized or equivalent cloud, or if you're using an MSP that backs your data up and they back it up to their data center, and it doesn't classify as a cloud solution, then they need a level 2 certification, for instance. So if they've got that and they back up data, they're all good, as long as that was part of the scope when they were assessed. So that's all good. Those are the kind of things you got to think about as far as scope goes, what actually gets missed in underscoping.
So pivoting the conversation a bit to vendors and IT providers, how big of an underscoping trap are they?
Good question. I just referenced some of it, but whatever, typically, if they're not dealing with any CUI, they're not backing it up, they don't have some sort of cloud sync program, cloud file sync and share, right? If they don't have that kind of program running or manage it or anything like that, then that's out of scope. So CUI will probably likely be out of scope. But they have to have their RMM configured correctly. They have to have all their services that do any kind of protection of the data. For instance, the SIM, their Security Information and Event Monitor, the antivirus that they provide, all that kind of fun stuff. They need to make sure those are configured properly, and those will be assessed with whatever CUI they provide protection for, right? And they'll be assessed against the controls that are applicable there. The other thing that they're going to need is a CRM, a customer responsibility matrix, or a shared responsibility matrix, but everybody just refers to it as a CRM these days. We call ours a CRM, but technically, really, it's a SRM. And we just call it a CRM because that's what everybody does now. Customer responsibility matrix is going to be going to go through all the different controls, hopefully all the assessment objectives. So at least 110 controls, if not all the 320 assessment objectives. We do ours by assessment objective, and but a CRM, a customer responsibility matrix, is going to say, here's all the controls or assessment objectives, and here's what the customer is responsible for. The SRM, or the shared responsibility matrix, is going to do the same thing with all the controls or assessment objectives, and it's going to show you what the customer is responsible for, what you're responsible for, and it's also going to show what the provider is responsible for. So on ours, we say, this is what we do, and this is what you're supposed to do. And so that one arguably is a lot more helpful because it spells out what the provider does, and it spells out what you're supposed to do. So there's no question there. But those CRMs, I'll just blanketly call them CRMs. So those CRMs are very important, and they help assessors look through verify that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. They also are very, very helpful for the OSC, or the person that's the company seeking certification, organization seeking certification. I guess I should use the right word. So OSC, or organization seeking compliance, I guess at this point. But those CRMs will explain to that company what that provider is providing to them and what their responsibilities are. Those are very important. If your provider has a MSP, for instance, has a level 2 certification, and their CRM was assessed, validated along with the assessment, with the assessment scope, then that goes a long way to helping the assessment out and making the assessment a lot quicker.
So on the flip side, why do companies overscope, and what's the actual fix?
Well, companies overscope for a few reasons, but the main one is they don't know what in the heck kind of CUI they have, and they don't know what in the heck is CUI. And most of that problem is the government's problem and the prime's problem that they're causing. And they're just saying, hey, here's your contract, and it has 7012 or whatever else in it, and there may be CUI in this contract, come in with this contract. So you're like, great, that's wonderful. Well, now tell me what is a CUI, and they'll say, well, any of it can be, and you push back, and they say, all of it's CUI. So now you're stuck trying to treat everything they give you as CUI when that's not the case. If you push back politely and firmly, because I know you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. If you push back politely and firmly and say, hey, look, we're trying to reduce our scope here, and we're trying to save you money as well as us money. Can you tell me what is CUI on here? And most of them, I don't know about most of them, but they're supposed to. Some of them do come back and say, yes, this is CUI, this is not. Right. Some of them may even portion mark things, and that is awesome. So portion marking being, here's a document, and this is CUI, this is not, this is CUI, this is not, right? So you don't see that a whole lot. You do see it some. But when they can tell you exactly what is CUI, that makes the picture a whole lot more clear. The unfortunate thing is that we see it with all of our clients, not just one or two, not 75%, 100% of our clients have this problem. And it is the DoD's problem. It is the prime's problem that they cause. They don't know what exactly is CUI. If it's not marked CUI and they push back and they get some vague answers, then if they think it's CUI, they just have to treat it as CUI, right? And so that ends up leading to overscoping, saying, well, I don't know what is CUI and what's not, so we'll just include our whole network. Wonderful, but you don't necessarily need to do that, right? Now, sometimes that doesn't really matter. If it's a small company and they've got a significant portion of DoW work, then that's probably going to be most of the employees working on it anyway, and it may not reduce the cost, but that's what helps lead to overscoping. Taking people's not involving the different parties at your organization that are actually involved in doing the work can also lead to overscoping, because the way I as an IT guy thinks things it can also lead to underscoping, but the way I as an IT guy thinks things probably happen, or the way the general manager or CEO or whoever it may be thinks that things happen isn't really always the way it happens. So you bring in some of the workers, some of the supervisors, whatever it may be, that actually deal with that work and do that work. They say, oh no, it doesn't go through this system, just this system. This is what happens. This is what we do. Or if they say, yeah, it comes through all these, but really doesn't need to, you can say, oh, you know what? In that case, why don't we change our process, and we can reduce the scope here, right? So not understanding the actual flow and what can be changed also leads to overscoping. And then if you're able to, sometimes you're not, Sometimes enclaves work, sometimes they don't. But if you're able to design an enclave, whether it's a VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, or whether it's something else, an actual room where there's one or two computers, or whatever it may be, if you can create an enclave and actually use that enclave, then that will help out a whole bunch. That'll help out a whole bunch and keep you from overscoping. If you can keep all the CUI in that enclave, in that room, on those computers, then that helps out a bunch.
Are there specific 2026 clarifications contractors should have on their radar for scoping decisions?
Yeah, there's a few things I talked about through the Cyber AB town halls and the FAQs, stuff like that. But they specifically, I don't know. I didn't know anybody that actually believed this, but they specifically stated encryption does not create a CUI boundary. Well, yeah, no, it doesn't. So that's understandable. But they did make that clarification. So I guess there are some people. I guess that's related to the once it's encrypted, it's not CUI any longer argument, which was always bogus. But a lot of people believe that and fully and emphatically defended it. So, but the DoW also came out in their FAQs and said if it's encrypted, it's still CUI, right? Logical separation, VLANs, things like that. They still require all the controls and all the explanations and all the diagrams and everything else. But you've got to show all that. One of the things that can reduce scope and reduce flow down is paper-only CUI. And one of the things I can think this easily applies to is contractors. So if you still have to protect paper CUI, but if a subcontractor, so your concrete guy, maybe, I don't know, needs some drawings or something to see where, to pour the concrete, what kind, and all that kind of fun stuff, then you can give him paper CUI or her paper CUI, and it still needs to be protected. DoDI 5200.48 explains that, but you don't your CMMC level 2 requirements don't flow down to that contractor if it's paper CUI only. The very second that contractor snaps a picture, scans it in, copies it, types it in, and draws a drawing of it, and makes it electronic somehow, they are now in scope. So if they can keep from doing anything that makes that CUI electronic or logical, then as long as it stays physical and paper CUI, then they don't come into scope for all of the CMMC level 2 controls. Again, they still have to protect that paper CUI per DoDI 5200.48, but they don't have to follow all the CMMC level 2 controls. That helps out a lot in some cases for contractors and whatnot, for construction companies especially. Some other things that were brought up are under the ESP umbrella, external service provider umbrella. So are you a ESP that's a CSP, or are you an ESP that's not a CSP? That's the way they define that. So a CSP is a cloud service provider. That's going to be like Microsoft 365, Google, AWS, and some others. So anybody that processes, stores, or transmits CUI in the cloud, and that cloud is readily available, easily expandable, doesn't require interaction from the provider to expand it or purchase more or whatever. There's 5 requirements. So if you meet those requirements of a CSP, then you're going to be a CSP. If you don't meet those requirements, you're just an ESP. So just an ESP. A ESP that's not a CSP includes, we're going to throw all sorts of TLAs at you, which is TLA is a 3-letter acronym. So an ESP that's not a CSP could be things like a managed service provider or an MSP, or managed security services provider, MSSP, things like that, right? any of those companies that provide service that may or may not, typically don't process, store, or transmit CUI, but could. And I just explained one of the caveats a minute ago with the backups. For instance, if you have an MSP, they're most likely going to be a security protection asset for you, and you'll need that CRM. If they back up your CUI to their quote enclave, I'll just call it an enclave. So if they back up your CUI to their enclave, that doesn't necessarily put them in scope as long as it's not in the cloud, as long as it doesn't fall under the CSP category. Then they're still just an ASP, but one that handles CUI. So if they do handle CUI in backups or anything like that, or file sync and share program, then they're going to have a level 2 certification. If they don't have if they don't handle CUI, then if they don't process, store, or transmit it, then they don't need a level 2 certification. It helps if they have one because that'll make a lot of things go a lot smoother. But what you have to have from them is the CRMs we were talking about just a minute ago. You have to have a CRM that's based on NIST 800-171 and list out all the controls and who's responsible, and preferably all of the assessment objectives, because really when you get assessed, an assessor will look at the assessment objectives to figure out if you meet that control. So there may be, 6 assessment objectives that are part of one control. Might only be one assessment objective, but it could be 6, could be even more. And if you don't meet one of those assessment objectives, you fail a control. So if you list out per assessment objective and say who's responsible for what, that's the best path forward there. But at the very least, you need to have a CRM based on the control, NIST 800-171 controls, all 110, that lists out the customer responsibilities. So you have to have that. That's another thing that was worth some clarification. NIST 800-145 outlines the cloud computing criteria if you want to go look at it. And also clarified that the DoW says that the FedRAMP 20X will not work. So if you have a cloud program that was certified under the FedRAMP 20X and not a previous program, it will not work. It has to be FedRAMP moderate authorized, FedRAMP moderate or higher authorized, or equivalency. And they did state that equivalency is a DoW. There's a DoW definition for equivalency, and that still holds. So Prevail, for instance, is FedRAMP equivalent, not authorized. But they've been thoroughly blessed by the by the DoD and whoever did their assessment. I can't remember who did their assessment off the top of my head. It's also worth noting that who knows what's going to happen with this CMMC pause. But just before the CMMC pause, the DoW did say, hey, we're starting to plan for revision 3, which if things had gone along normally, I would say, you're looking at probably 2 or 3 years before you have to worry about it. But you have to plan now. You have to start planning now because there are some changes, right? Right? It's going to change your policies up. It's going to change your SSP up. It's going to change how you do a few things. It's going to bring some more things into scope. So there are fewer controls, but there are more assessment objectives. So it's arguably harder, arguably more intensive and more complex, I guess I should say. So there's more to it. Who knows where that's going to go with this whole CMMC pause thing, where they're trying to make things less complicated and less costly. If you look at their Brilliant at the Basics program, one, it doesn't really have any good definitions to it. It's just a marketing thing, really. But if you look at that, one of the things they talk about is phishing resistant MFA. Well, in CMMC and NIST 800-171, you have to have an MFA in place. It doesn't say phishing resistant. Now, I implore you to go ahead and please have some phishing resistant MFA in place. But that said, it is more complex. It is, not as easy to put in as, you may have to jump through some more hoops to make that work, or you may have to get rid of some old legacy program that meets all the controls, except it doesn't have phishing resistant MFA, right? So, I mean, they list things out like that arguably make it harder and more complex, and yet they're saying, hey, we want to reduce cost and complexity, right? And so it'll be very interesting to see what comes up. I've waited and redone our response to the RFI, and so I think I'm going to look over it one more time, and then I'll probably submit it tonight. So probably submit it before I leave work today, which is today is the 13th, so it's before the 14th deadline. In any case, back to the questions, scoping clarifications to know. The only other thing worth noting that it doesn't really affect your scope right now, but the FAR CUI rule, the federal government is trying to standardize things, and so the FAR CUI rule is a first stab at that, and so this whole CMMC pause may be part of it as well. Although I have a huge reservation about the numbers they used and the reason they used to pause it. But could the CMMC program use some reworking? Yes, and we've said that from the get-go. There's several things in there. I would say the first thing that causes a lot of pain is the non-poemable items. POAM is a plan of action of milestones. So you can't, if you get assessed, you have some POAM items, great. You have 6 months to clear them up. Wonderful. Except that there's 5-pointers and 3-pointers. They can't be POAM'd. There's a few 1-pointers that can't be POAM'd. So if you fail any of those, you just fail your assessment. It'd be nice if you could POAM any of those items and have 6 months or a year to clear them up. There's several things that they could do to reduce the complexity, cost, and the burden on companies. Although I will say that the DoD's been harping on this since 2017, before 2017, but the end of 2017, boom, you're supposed to be compliant with 800.171 revision 2, right? Or I guess revision 1 at the time, but anyway, you're supposed to be compliant with 800.171. They've talked about it. The reason the certifications came along is because they realized companies were just not actually being compliant. They were going, yeah, we're good, and not actually being good. So the change to revision 3, that could fall into this whole CMMC pause. Who knows? We'll see, but that'll be coming at some point.
You kind of touched up on False Claims Act a little bit earlier, but has scoping specifically ever been the legal basis for a False Claims Act case?
Yes, it has for some. So the most recent example, LogZone, they didn't say anything about scoping really. Although, you could arguably say that it wasn't scoped properly, and so they didn't implement all the controls, but that wasn't specifically said on that one. So again, we don't know all the gory details. But I think it was a Georgia Tech case, that they specifically said, I think they excluded the labs or something like that, and said they weren't in scope when in fact they actually were in scope. So yes, scoping has been an issue in some of these False Claims Act investigations and settlements. And mind you, all of them that aren't actually in progress right now, all of them have been settled, they haven't gone through to a court verdict or anything. So at least that I can think of. Which doesn't matter here or there, I guess, because if you settle it, you're still
admitting fault
or to some degree, and spending money on fines and whatnot. Yes, scoping absolutely could lead to a False Claims Act, and so that's why you need to get it right. If you overscope, that's probably not going to get you a False Claims Act investigation, but if you underscope, it absolutely could lead to a False Claims Act. If you say, yeah, I've got this one little enclave here, and John Doe and Sally Joe, they use it, and they're the only ones in scope. There's 2 computers in there. There's a network in there that's all in scope, all that kind of fun stuff. And that's where our enclave is. But you continue to process information outside of that enclave and just not recognize it, and somebody says, hey, we've got this problem here, and you don't do anything about it. And that's when the whistleblower comes along. By the way, whistleblowers are financially incentivized. They get 20% or something of the settlement. So, if it's $1 million settlement, $200,000, boom, right in your pocket, right? So that's an issue and something to be aware of. So you need to make sure you get scoping right. You don't need to underscope because it might get you in trouble, but you also don't need to overscope and cost yourself more money. So you're walking that,
fine line.
Yeah,
almost.
that high line wire, that fine line. So yes, that False Claims Act absolutely can come about for underscoping.
So you mentioned enclaves a bit earlier. For some, it can be a fix for overscoping. Can that also cause some failures there too?
Yes, and I kind of mentioned this a minute ago. Some people buy a CMMC in a box, which is usually an enclave with, their policy templates and SSP template and stuff like that. You just customize it and boom, you're good to go. Except that you're very well may not be good to go. So if you put one of those, enclaves in place, you got to make sure you're fully utilizing that enclave and that nothing is no COI is being processed, stored, or transmitted outside of that enclave. You also have to make sure that none of your SPD is outside of that enclave unless you've documented it. If you've documented where your SPD comes from, like maybe your Active Directory is on a domain controller outside your enclave, as long as you configure it properly, that can happen, but you've got to configure it properly. You've got to document it and you've got to show what you do, right? But all your COI absolutely has to be in that enclave. If you're stating this is my enclave, that's where your COI stays. It can't be processed, transmitted, or stored anywhere outside of that enclave. What we see with some clients that we have worked with is that they bought an enclave and weren't sure about it. And so we came into the picture and we looked and figured out that, oh, yeah, it's great that you got an enclave, but you've got all sorts of COI spillage outside this enclave. And so you're not going to pass an assessment unless you lie. And I would not suggest lying. So then we're talking about False Claims Act again, right? But yes, that's those enclaves can absolutely help, but you have to absolutely use them like they're supposed to be used.
So with all that being mentioned, what does a defensible scope look like for a company that actually needs to do some protection there?
Well, really, so your SSP is going to tell your story, tell how you protect things, how you protect that CUI, and where your SPA comes in, where your security protection assets come in, and it's also going to say, what's out of scope, what's a specialized asset, all that kind of fun stuff. What's a contractor risk managed asset? So it's going to define all of that. Your policies are going to be, thou shalt not, kind of thing. This is how we do things. This is what we require. You're going to have some procedures that go in there that shows how you do things step by step. But without going down that rabbit hole too much, your SSP really is going to tell your story. Your scope is going to be included in there, whether it's an enclave or an enterprise-wide setup, and how that boundary is defined, what's inside that boundary, what external systems connect to it, all that kind of fun stuff. And that defines your scope, and your whole SSP is built around that. All those definitions, all those explanations of how all that works together, that's gonna tell your story, and that's going to be a defensible scope. And now that's very high level. There's a lot more to it than that. But yes, that SSP tells your story. It defines your boundaries, your external connections, and everything else, right? And connects all your policies, procedures, your list, your configurations, all that kind of fun stuff. Connects all those. So that's going to be where all that is kind of defined at and where it's defensible.
So, Brooke, if someone only remembers one thing from today's episode, what should it be?
Scoping. I mean, we're talking about scoping. So, I'd say the first thing always you can take it out of the scoping argument and say it's something on its own, which we kind of attack it as its own thing, but it's part of scoping. Anyway, is knowing what CUI you have, right? And knowing where it's at. So once you know what CUI you have and where it's at, then you can figure out how to scope properly. Where does all of it, I was going to say where does it live, but where is it processed, stored, and transmitted right now? And could you clean that up and tighten up that scope, right? Could you create an enclave and really tighten up that scope? So determining where it is, determining what CUI you have, determining where it is or your data flow helps you create a correct scope and decide whether you can tighten that down to an enclave or what you need to do. So that's the most critical thing, is figuring out that scoping.
If you have any questions about what we covered, reach out to us. We're here to help fast track your compliance journey. Text, email, or call in your questions and we'll answer them for free here on the podcast. You can find our contact info at CMMCcomplianceguide.com. Stay tuned for our next episode. Until then, stay compliant, stay secure, and make sure to subscribe.